Hello and welcome to Lesson 1, Stock Splits. Our objectives are to understand the concept of a stock split as well as a reverse stock split, to calculate the pre- and post-split values associated with number of shares and price per share. In this chart here, you can see Apple Computers, and you can tell when they had a 2-for-1 stock split because the blue line suddenly drops right down and becomes the red line. Notice that when you're looking at charts on the internet, they usually fill in prior history. You can see what the stock looked like if it had split some time ago. So let's start from the beginning. What is a stock split? This is a good illustration to help you visualize what a stock split does. This is an example of a forward stock split, or what you typically think of when you hear stock split. So before the split, we had 100 shares at $100. After the stock split, you now had, in this case, 1,000 shares at $10. But notice that the total investment stays the same. This is our market capitalization. Before the split, we had 10,000, and after the split, we had 10,000. So what we're doing is adjusting the price as well as the shares, but the total value stays the same. Let's go ahead and read more specifically. It is a corporate action that increases the number of corporation's outstanding shares by dividing each share, which in turn divides its price by the same ratio. The stock's market capitalization remains the same. Just like the value of a $100 bill does not change if it is exchanged for two 50s. For example, with a 2-for-1 stock split, each stockholder receives an additional share for each share held, but the value of each share is reduced by half. 2 shares now equal the original value of 1 share before the split. Let's look at a reverse stock split. It's really the same thing, just in reverse. In this chart here, before the split we had 10,000 shares at 5 cents. We did a reverse stock split and now we have 500 shares at $1. But notice, our total investment is still worth $500. That's a reverse stock split. So what is the point of a stock split then if the value stays the same? Well, there's a couple of reasons, a couple of big reasons. Number one is it's just psychology. Typically, as the price of the stock gets higher and higher, some investors might feel that the price is too high for them to buy a share of stock, or small investors may feel it is unaffordable. So, by splitting the stock, it brings the share price down to a more attractive level. Even though the actual value of the stock doesn't change, it makes it seem more affordable. Reason number 2 for splitting a stock is to increase a stock's liquidity, meaning turning into cash more quickly, which increases the stock's number of outstanding shares. When stocks get into the hundreds of dollars per share, very large bid/ask price spreads can result. So here's an example. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. This stock has never had a stock split, and its bid-ask spread can often be over $100. And as of November 2013, its Class A shares were trading at just over $173,000 each. So, do you think the average investor can even buy 1 share of Berkshire Hathaway? Most likely not. This is the reason that many companies go ahead and complete stock splits. So let's look at some of the more common stock splits. We have a 2-for-1, a 3-for-2, and a 3-for-1. Now realize that there's a lot of different ones. And in this chart you can see we have a 1-for-10 as well. But these are some of the more common stock splits you're going to see. And if you'll notice, this chart analyzes number of shares, share price, and market cap, which again is the total value of the shares outstanding. So notice in all these cases, in a 2-for-1, let's look at that one. We have 10 million shares on the pre-split and then 20 million on the post-split, so it doubled. But look at our price. We used to have 1 share valued at $10 a share. Now each share is only valued at $5 a share. Easier to get into the market. But obviously your market cap, the total value, remains the same. Let's try some examples. What we're going to do is use proportional reasoning to determine the number of outstanding shares after a stock split or a reverse stock split. We're also going to use that reasoning to help us determine the pre or post price. So let's look at example 1. On December 4th, John Deere Corporation instituted a 2-for-1 stock split. Before the split, the market price was $87.68, and the corporation had 1.2 billion shares outstanding. What we want to determine is the pre-split market cap. So we want to know what is the value of all that stock. And then we want to determine what was the post-split number of shares outstanding. In order to figure out the pre-split market cap, we take the price per share, which was $87.68, and then we multiply it by how many billions of shares there are outstanding. In this case, it was 1.2 billion. When we multiply those together, we end up with 105.216 billion, since this is in billions, shares, or value of the shares. So the total value of John Deere shares is 105.216 billion. Now let's look at the post-split number of shares outstanding. In this case, we want to look at proportional reasoning. Whenever we are determining the post or pre number of shares or price, we want to set up some words for us to look at. So in this case, post number of shares over pre number of shares. Now you could flip it if you wanted to, but either way this is going to help guide us when we set up our proportional fractions. So we're having a stock split. Remember what that means. We're going to get more shares worth less dollars. So our post number of shares is going to be 2, and our pre number of shares is 1, because that's what we say. We're going to get 2 shares for every 1. And then we're going to set this equal to what we know. Okay, the corporation had 1.2 billion shares outstanding. That would then be our pre number of shares. And we want to determine what our post number of shares is. So we want to determine X. From here, this is just a case of cross multiplication. X times 1 will give us X, and 2 times 1.2 will give us 2.4 billion. And that's how many shares are going to be outstanding after our 2-for-1 stock split. So let's make sure that makes sense. We started with 1.2. We're doubling our stock. This is definitely doubled. Let's try another example. In this example, Qualcomm Inc. instituted a 4-for-1 stock split. After the split, Elena owned 12,800 shares. How many shares did she own before the split? So pause the tape and go ahead and set up your proportion. If we follow what we wrote, my post-stock shares are going to be 4, and my pre-stock shares are 1. So for every 1 share, I am going to get 4 shares. Now let's fill in what we know. After the split, Elena owned 12,800. That's post the stock split. So that would go on top, 12,800. And we want to know what she had pre-stock split. So we put an X there. Once again, if we cross multiply, X times 4 is 4X, and 1 times 12,800 is just 12,800. Solving for X, I would divide both sides by 4. 4's cancel, they turn into 1, so 1x is equal to 3,200 shares. Once again, let's make sure this makes sense. So we had a 4-for-1 stock split. If she started with 3,200 shares, she should have 4 times as many when she ends, and she does, 12,800. Let's look at a third example. In this case now we're going to look at price, and price is a little bit different. We have to be careful how we set up our proportion. So remember, price has an inverse relationship with number of shares. When in a 2-for-1 stock split, our shares go up, they double, but remember that our price goes down. It gets cut in half. Cigna instituted a 3-for-1 stock split. Before the split, Cigna had 200 million shares with a price of $168 per share. We want to determine how many shares were outstanding after the split, so something we've already done, And then we want to determine what the post-split price is before the share, and that'll be new. So let's set up our fractions. I've written out my fractions: post shares, pre-shares, post price, pre-price. And notice I've made a description rather than just post and pre in order to help my brain think about what needs to go on top and what needs to go on bottom. Well, 3-for-1 stock split means I'm going to have more stock afterwards. So my post split number is 3 and my pre-split number is 1. So if we set up our proportional fractions, we had 200 million shares before the split, so that's down here, and we want to know how much we're going to have after. If we cross multiply, we get 1x is equal to 600. So that was fairly easy. We know we're going to have 600 million shares afterwards, or 3 times as many. Now let's think about our post and pre-price. Well, remember, there's an inverse relationship here. So we're getting more stock, but we're getting more stock at less of a value. So now, instead of having $168 per share, we're now going to have a third of that. So our post price is only going to be 1 if our pre-price was 3. Whatever we started with, we're going to have less. So the smaller number now goes on top. Okay, before the split, our price was $168. That goes down here on the bottom, under the pre-price. And we want to determine what our post price is. So if we cross multiply, x times 3 is 3x, and 1 times 168 is 168. Dividing by 3 will help us solve for x. 3 divided by 3 is 1x, and 168 divided by 3 gives us $56. So does that make sense? Our price has gone down. We started with 168. At the end, each share is now only worth $56. That's a third of this. That works, so we know we've done it correctly. Let's look at just a couple more quick examples. In this example, Johnson Controls instituted a 3-for-2 stock split. So that's a little bit different, but still let's think about what it means. For every 2 shares you own, you're going to get 3. After the split, Lisa owned 45,000 shares. The price of 1 share was $39.24. So we know the information post. Let's go ahead and fill in our fractions and our proportional fractions. Okay, our post shares, let's see, we're going to have 3 compared to our pre, which is 2. If we set this up, our post shares in this case are given. After the split, she had 45,000 shares, and we want to know what she had to start. Cross multiply, and we get 3x equals 90. Divide both sides by 3, and we find that x is equal to 30 shares. That's what she had to start. When she finished, she had 1.5 times as much, 45,000. Now let's look at price. All right, so remember the inverse relationship. So our post price should be less. So our post price should be 2 as compared to 3. All right, what do we know? The post price of 1 share was $39.24. So we need to stick that on the post side up here on top, $39.24. And we need to know what they were worth at the start. Well, if we cross multiply, we get 2x is equal to, and when I multiply these two together, I get 117.72. When I divide both sides by 2, I end up with a price of $58, and I just did that in my calculator, and 86 cents. So again, let's make sure that makes sense. How much was it worth before? It was worth more per share before. When we have a stock split, it should be worth less after, and $39.24 is less than where we started at $58.86. Final example. In this example, we have a stock split, a 1-for-20 reverse stock split. So here's how we know. It says reverse stock split. We know we're going to go the opposite direction. Before the split, the market price was 64 cents, and there were 580 million shares outstanding. We want to know the post-split price per share and number of shares. So this is post. So for our final problem, pause the video and see if you can solve this. All right, well hopefully you wrote down your ratios correctly. So our post shares are now only going to be 1. We're going to get 1 share for every 20 that we own. Remember, this is a reverse stock split. So there were 580 million shares to start with. That's our pre. What are we going to own afterwards? Once again, we will cross multiply. So I just took 580 million and wrote it as 580m. When we solve for x, which means we divide both sides by 20, we get 29 million shares. Notice that our shares have been reduced. So we have basically now taken 1/20th of this amount, and this is the number of shares outstanding. But now the price per share is going to go up. In some ways, this makes it seem more valuable. So stocks like penny stocks, there might be some reverse stock splits to make the stock seem more valuable. So they'll give you less shares, but at a higher price. Okay, so let's fill in the rest of this ratio. Well, our pre-price is only 64 cents, and we want to know what our post price is. So once again, cross multiply, we get 1x is equal to $12.80. So now, instead of just 64 cents per share, it is now $12.80 per share. This concludes our lesson on stock splits. At this time, you should understand the concept of a stock split as well as a reverse stock split, and maybe some of the reasons why a company might do that. Also, you should be able to use proportional reasoning to calculate the pre and post split values, both with number of shares and price per share.